You're stretched out on a dirt floor. Your stomach is swollen. This is the 4th time you've been pregnant in 6 years. You're only 17. None of the children you carried belong to you anymore. The first was a boy. They sold him when he was 3. You still remember his face pressed against your chest the morning they took him away. You still remember the sound he made as they pulled him from you, a sound that comes back to you in your sleep. The second was a girl, sent to a plantation in Mississippi. She was 18 months old. You never saw her name written down. In the records, she wasn't a child, just inventory, a number, a price tag. The third never made it out alive. In your 7th month, the overseer beat you because you didn't pick fast enough. They forced you to dig a hole and lie face down so the whip wouldn't strike your belly. It didn't matter. You lost her anyway. Now there's another one on the way. A 4th. And you already know how this ends. You won't keep this one either. Because to them, you aren't a mother. You're a breeder. That's the word written in the plantation ledgers. You're recorded the same way they list livestock. No name. Just your age, your condition, and one word that defines your entire existence: fertile. This is America. Virginia. 1842, and what's being done to you isn't illegal. It isn't considered abuse. It isn't even seen as unusual. It's business. They called it natural increase, though there was nothing natural about it. This is the story of the breeding farms, the darkest chapter of American slavery they never taught you in school. Before we go on, if this story has you hooked, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps us keep uncovering the voices history tried to erase. In 1808, the United States outlawed the importation of enslaved people from Africa. Politicians congratulated themselves. Abolitionists celebrated. The world believed America had taken its first real step toward ending slavery. They were wrong. The ban didn't cripple slavery, it reshaped it into something colder, more deliberate, more profitable, and far more horrific. Before 1808, plantation owners who needed labor bought people from ships arriving from Africa. After the ban, the ships stopped coming. The supply vanished. But demand didn't slow, it surged. Cotton ruled the economy. The cotton gin had turned the Deep South into an agricultural gold rush. Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, they needed bodies. Hundreds of thousands of them to work fields that ran to the horizon. So the Upper South found a new commodity. Not tobacco. Not wheat. People. Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, these states shifted from growing crops to producing enslaved humans. Thomas Jefferson himself boasted that the birth of black children was increasing Virginia's capital stock by 4% a year. Read that again. The third president of the United States, the author of All Men Are Created Equal, bragging about human beings the way a rancher boasts about cattle. By 1860, the total monetary value of enslaved people in America reached $4 billion, more than every bank in the nation combined, more than all currency in circulation, more than every factory and railroad put together. Enslaved people weren't just labor. They were wealth itself. They were used as collateral for loans. They were inheritance passed down through families. Newborns were described in financial language, as interest, as returns on the investment made in their mothers. Virginia alone exported more than 300,000 enslaved people to the Deep South between 1800 and 1860. Richmond became one of the largest slave markets in the Western Hemisphere. But here's what the textbooks leave out. Slaveholders didn't simply hope enslaved women would have children. They planned it. They controlled it. And to understand how, you have to see the system through their eyes. You're barely a woman, still a girl, really. A man stands in front of you, examining you. His hands grip your jaw, tilting your head upward. He checks your teeth the way someone inspects a horse before a sale. He studies your body, your frame, your build, and writes something down in a ledger. Then he assigns you a husband. A man twice your age. A stranger. Chosen for one reason only, his size. That night, you'll be locked inside a cabin with him. This system appears again and again across thousands of plantations. The Massey family of Virginia kept records for over 100 years. They called it a stock book, the same term used for animals. In its pages, they recorded more than 350 enslaved children who were born, raised, and sold for profit. The process was calculated and cruel. On breeding plantations, the balance of women to men was intentionally distorted. Women were evaluated like livestock at auction. Age mattered, the younger and healthier, the better. Hips mattered. A woman who had already proven she could bear healthy children was worth far more. Some plantations employed men survivors later called stockmen. Maggie Stenhouse, interviewed by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, described what she saw. After weighing and testing them, owners hired these men out and locked them in rooms with young women chosen to produce children. The stockmen were enslaved men selected for strength and size. They received slightly better treatment, more food, less field labor, in exchange for being forced to breed. When the door was unlocked the next morning, one WPA witness recalled, the enslaved man was glad to get out, as them women nearly killed him. The women fought back. They scratched. They bit. They resisted with everything they had. But resistance always carried a price. Another formerly enslaved woman testified, the women hated him, and the men on the place hated him too. Everybody knew what was going on. Everybody was either a victim or part of it. There was no way out. Frederick Douglass wrote about a woman named Caroline, purchased solely for breeding by a poor white enslaver named Edward Covey. Covey hired a man named Bill Smith to father her children. Douglass wrote that Covey forced Caroline to abandon herself to the object for which he bought her. The object, not a person, an object. That's how these women were seen, as things meant to produce more things. Once you were chosen, once you were labeled a breeder, your life became an endless loop. You're 23 now. 6 births in 9 years. Your body shows it, the scars, the stretch marks, the exhaustion that never fades. Your first boy would be 12 by now. Old enough to work fields somewhere. You don't know where. Maybe Mississippi. Maybe Louisiana. You don't know if he's alive. You never will. The girl would be 10. You try not to imagine her face, because it's starting to blur, and that terrifies you. The third never breathed. The fourth was sold at 18 months. By then, you'd learned not to name them. Naming made it hurt more. The fifth went at 2 years old. Now you're pregnant again. The sixth. And you feel nothing. No fear. No hope. Just a hollow numbness where something human once lived. This was the cycle, recorded again and again, intentional, engineered to destroy women completely. Some bore 10, 12, even 15 children and kept none of them. Rose Williams, interviewed long after emancipation, still carried the weight of it. She described being forced to share a cabin with a man named Rufus. When she resisted, her enslaver threatened to whip her. She said, "I thinks about Massa buying me off the block and saving me from being parted from my folks. I thinks about being whipped. There it is. What can I do? What can I do?" For words that echo through thousands of testimonies. In the Massey family stock book, children are listed as increase, the same term used for interest accumulating in a bank. As soon as they could work, around 5 or 6, they began producing profit. As soon as they could survive being separated, usually by age 2 or 3, they could be sold. Families were torn apart without warning. Mothers came back from the fields and found their children missing. No farewell. No reason given. Just a hollow place where a person had been. One WPA interview captured it plainly. Infants were torn from their mothers' arms and sold off to speculators. Brothers and sisters were split apart and never laid eyes on each other again. Another woman, Delia Garlick, remembered the day they took her mother. "I never seen her again. I don't know what happened to her. She was only a child when it occurred, and she lived the rest of her life without answers." Another recalled, "I seen her sit right down on a stump and cry about it, but she said there wasn't nothing could be done, 'cause it was the slavery law." The slavery law. As though a law could make it anything other than what it truly was: mass-scale human trafficking, factory-style exploitation, the deliberate destruction of families for profit. And the men behind it weren't lurking in the dark. They were respectable, well-known businessmen. Men like Calvin Smith. Calvin Smith operated one of Virginia's most infamous breeding enterprises. At any moment, his holdings included 50 to 60 enslaved women. His specialty was producing light-skinned children. Mulatto slaves fetched higher prices. Lighter skin meant greater value in the markets. So Smith forced his own slaves to bear biracial children, children who carried his blood. Then he sold them at auction. His own flesh and blood. Sold like livestock. This wasn't rumor or hearsay. It was recorded in contemporary documents. Smith ran his operation openly. Everyone in the region knew his business model. No one intervened. No one charged him, because everything he did was legal. Women who resisted were met with violence meant to break them. Whipping was routine. But beating a pregnant woman posed a problem: you could damage the merchandise. The solution appears again and again in historical sources. You're made to dig a hole in the ground deep enough for your swollen stomach. Then you lie face down, your pregnancy lowered into the hole, protected, your back left bare. The overseer lashes you until you stop screaming or until he grows tired. Whichever happens first. Sit with that. A system so devoted to cruelty that it engineered a way to beat pregnant women safely. Safe for the fetus. Not for the woman. Some women resisted however they could. They chewed cotton root bark to induce miscarriage. They drank tansy tea. They took back what little control they could over their own bodies. Others went further. In 1856, Margaret Garner fled Kentucky to Ohio with her husband and 4 children. When slave catchers surrounded the house, she made a choice that still echoes. She decided her children would never return to bondage, whatever the cost. At her trial, she said she would rather see them dead than enslaved again. This is the story Toni Morrison built Beloved upon. Because some truths are so heavy that only fiction can hold them. Harriet Jacobs, who escaped slavery and authored one of the most important slave narratives in American history, wrote that slavery was far worse for women. "Slavery is terrible for men," she said, "but far more terrible for women." Added to the shared burden were sufferings and humiliations uniquely their own. Mortifications. The word fails. All the words fail. But if you want to grasp the full horror, you have to follow it to the end, where these women stood after the breeding, after the births, after the beatings, after the block. You're standing on an auction platform in Richmond. You're exposed. Buyers inspect you, pinching your arms, prying open your mouth, testing your body. One asks if you've had children before. The auctioneer replies, yes. 3. All healthy. That makes you more valuable. The bidding begins. You stand there while men argue over your price. They speak as if you're not present. As if you can't hear them. As if you're furniture. One says you look strong. Another says your hips are good for bearing. A third asks whether you've ever tried to escape. You haven't. But you've thought about it every day of your life. The gavel strikes. You're sold. You don't know who bought you. You don't know where you're going. You only know that everything you've ever known is gone. Richmond was among the largest slave markets in the Western Hemisphere. Some estimates suggest 10 to 20,000 enslaved people passed through the city during peak years. Streets were lined with slave jails and holding pens where human beings waited to be sold. Lumpkin's Jail, the Devil's Half-Acre, names that told you exactly what kind of place it was. There were categories, just like at a livestock sale. Prime field hands, young men at the height of physical strength. Breeding women, females who had proven they could deliver healthy children. And then there were the fancy girls. Young women, often light-skinned, sold to wealthy buyers for reasons unrelated to field labor. They commanded the highest prices, sometimes 2 or 3 times what a field hand brought. Between 1790 and 1860, the domestic slave trade forced 1 million enslaved people from the Upper South to the Deep South. Historians call it the Second Middle Passage. 1 million people chained together, crammed onto boats, hauled in wagons, from Virginia to Mississippi, from Maryland to Louisiana, from Kentucky to Texas. Nearly half of those who were transported were torn away from their husbands or wives. Even more were ripped from parents, from children. In 1832, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, the president's grandson, testified before the Virginia legislature. He stated that Virginia was exporting around 8,500 enslaved people every year. His words were blunt: "It is a practice, and a growing one in parts of Virginia, to raise slaves for market. Raised for sale. Like animals." James Goulson, another Virginia lawmaker, likened the rights of slaveholders to those of people who owned broodmares. "The increase from enslaved women," he said, "forms a large portion of our wealth." These weren't fringe voices. These were widely accepted ideas, spoken openly on legislative floors. The system even had its own language. Breeding stock. Increase. Natural reproduction. Fancy girls. Stockmen. Every term a euphemism. Every euphemism masking something horrific. And then, one day, it ended. Drop a comment: do you think this history was deliberately hidden, or simply allowed to fade away? The Emancipation Proclamation arrived in 1863. The 13th Amendment followed in 1865. Slavery ended. The silence began. The breeding farms were never prosecuted. Calvin Smith was never held accountable. The Massey family retained their land, their wealth, their status. The men who built fortunes through human trafficking and forced reproduction died in comfort, their descendants still influential. The women who survived had no recourse. No reparations. No recognition. Many couldn't speak of what had been done to them. The trauma ran too deep. The shame, never theirs to bear, was crushing. Some tried anyway. After emancipation, Southern newspapers filled with ads, desperate notices from mothers searching for sons and daughters sold decades earlier. For years, the Lost Friends column of the Southwestern Christian Advocate ran week after week, filled with the same anguished pleas. Sold from Richmond in 1848. A boy named Jacob. About 3 years old. A scar on his left cheek. Last seen in Montgomery, Alabama, my daughter Mary. She would be 26 now. Taken from me while she was still nursing. Seeking my mother, Lucinda. Sold from Petersburg when I was 7. Any information gratefully received. Looking for my 4 children, Samuel, Anna, Joseph, and little Mary, sold to a trader in 1856. I have never stopped searching. These were more than advertisements. They were wounds set in ink. Year after year, week after week, mothers searching for children who had grown into strangers. Children looking for mothers they barely remembered. Most searches ended with nothing. Records were missing. Names were altered. People moved, died, vanished into a nation that had never regarded them as fully human. Some searched for 20 years. 30. Until death stopped them. By 1860, there were 4 million enslaved people in America. Only 400,000 had been transported from Africa. So where did the other 3.6 million come from? They were born, intentionally, systematically, on American soil. Their mothers were not treated as mothers. They were production sites. Their fathers were sometimes strangers forced into the same space. Sometimes overseers. Sometimes the enslavers themselves. Their births weren't celebrations. They were transactions. And from their first breath, their lives belonged to someone else. This history rarely appears in textbooks. It wasn't taught in most classrooms. For more than a century, it survived only as an uncomfortable footnote, when it was mentioned at all. Yet the evidence has always been there. The WPA narratives. Plantation records. Stock books. Bills of sale. The Lost Friends columns filled with unanswered names. The truth was never hidden. America just chose not to look. But we are looking now. The woman on the dirt floor, she was real. Maybe not one woman, but thousands like her. Women never meant to be remembered. Women preserved only as numbers, prices, breeding stock. She may have spent her entire life on a Virginia plantation, giving birth every year or two until her body gave out. Then sold south, forced into cotton fields until she collapsed. She may have watched 10 children disappear, one by one, never knowing where they were taken, never hearing their names again. She might have died without ever holding a grandchild. Or she might have survived. Might have lived long enough to see freedom in 1865. She may have spent 30 years searching for children taken while they were still nursing. Placing newspaper ads that no one answered. Walking town to town, carrying the description of a 3-year-old boy who would be a grown man now, if he lived. Asking strangers if they knew anyone named Jacob. Or Mary. Or Samuel. Most never found them. That's what the breeding farms created. Not just labor for cotton fields. Not just wealth for planters. They created generations of shattered families. Millions of children who never knew their mothers. Millions of mothers who never stopped searching. A wound so deep it still echoes. 4 million enslaved people by 1860. Every one born to a woman who had no choice. Every one loved by a mother. Every one someone's child. And most of them died without ever being reunited. The breeding farms didn't just produce slaves. They produced ghosts. Millions of them, drifting through history without names, graves, or monuments. Until now. Remember them. This is Crown and Dagger. We don't sanitize the past. We show what actually happened. If this story mattered to you, if you believe these women deserve remembrance, like and subscribe. More stories like this are coming.